Asymmetrical Haircuts Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet. On this podcast, we talk a lot about the legal aspects of atrocity crimes cases and potential cases.
But to get there, the facts proven in court, then the prosecutors also have to rely a great deal on forensic science. And like international law, that's a really rapidly changing and evolving field.
So to talk about some of the challenges and changes, producer Margarita and I went on a reporting trip without you in March. And we went to the ICMP, the International Commission on Missing Persons, and got a tour of their newly opened DNA laboratories.
Please come in. So what we have here along the right-hand side, and please mingle and just take a look. Mm-hmm. This is our post-mortem workflow. So this is our first facility where we receive the bones in and we will triage them. So we will examine them, we'll remove the exterior surface with the mechanical drills that you can see on the side there, very similar to what a dentist would use.
So if you've never been in a forensic laboratory, imagine several white labs with glass windows, rows of machine, test tubes, and a storing room with boxes cataloguing all the remains.
This is extraction. We have a number of different processes here. We do different extraction techniques depending on the samples that we receive or the condition of the samples that we receive, because the majority of time we do receive bones or teeth in various states and conditions. But we extract, we quant. Again, you can see we've got something UVing over here because they were working in this not so long ago. We are increasingly moving towards automated workflows wherever we can. Mm-hmm. And we are keen to do that because it allows us to significantly increase throughput. But the nature of the samples we get are very varied. So we will always have manual workflows accompanying that, or parts of the workflow will be manual so that we can adapt as we need to. This is our new reference lab, which is about 4 times the size of what we had before. Mm-hmm.
What is it used for?
For the reference samples, so for the DNA samples from the families of the missing. Mm. So the buccal swabs and the blood samples that are sent through. We expect this will be used a lot. We can get a lot more through there now.
So there they extract the DNA and then they analyze it. Yeah.
Wow, that sounds super interesting, Steph. Of course, we've spoken about ICMP before. I'm going to do the Stephopedia bit here. This is the organisation that came out of the 1990s Balkans War and did a lot of mass grave identification of bodies, for instance, around the 1995 Srebrenica massacre of some 8,000 Muslim men and boys. I was speaking recently to somebody who was saying to me that it felt very new and controversial just at that time. So I was thinking that we should also dig back and find out what people were feeling at the time about the idea of identifying all of these bones. But ICMP itself has now grown into a really much larger international org based in The Hague, but operating in many countries and under lots of different circumstances.
Yeah, some of our more religious listeners will have heard that we spoke earlier to ICMP head Catherine Bomberger before about missing migrants in the Mediterranean on episode 36 called Bringing Up the Bodies. This time we asked about the ICMP's expanding role and how this new DNA lab would help. First, Catherine explained that there are big advances in intergenerational DNA matching.
There are new technologies available in the world that weren't available previously. And some of our colleagues here in the laboratory I'm very proud of the fact that they've been part of advancing these new scientific methodologies, including the use of next-generation sequencing, where we can now make a direct match between a great-great-grandparent and a great-great-grandchild. So that's important around the world to make a third generation direct match because many families of the missing may have lost most of their relatives, so you don't have much material left, or in the case where there are large intergenerational differences between the time period of the person going missing and those relatives that are left behind to donate reference samples to find them. Secondly, it allows us to increase our throughput, which means we can do more samples now. And sadly, this is important in the world because of the consequences of global warming. Now, the increase in the number of conflicts, according to the Norwegian Peace and Research Institute, it's the highest number of conflicts since 1946. So this is not just our imagination, and I have a feeling it's not going to get any better. So, and of course, this is leading to an increase in migrants. So it's very important now that there is a standing capacity in the world that includes this laboratory that can help rich and poor countries alike, because there are countries that are being affected every day to try to build each time there is a natural, catastrophe or conflict. To build this capacity takes time and a lot of money. So having a standing capability like this is cost effective, it's pragmatic, it's very modern, because once you have the biological samples, you can share these samples, electronically. Of course, respecting the privacy rights of families of the missing, which we can get into data protection. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, connected to this. Each calamity these days is an international event. So you never know who's missing. For example, in the Greek wildfires, you can have a migrant who goes missing, or a Greek national who's missing, or a tourist who's missing, and you don't know. So having a global response to this, where you maintain a data system capability that has within it profiles from around the world, can also help in these cases. So I think what we're trying to do is to respond to an unfortunate need in the world because of all these reasons, and then to recognize, despite people trying to do the contrary, that we are a globalized world, that we're one world, and that we need to work together to help each other.
So the ICMP is actually trying to change itself into more of one of these standing mechanisms to do both war and disaster identification.
Yeah, and as Catherine explained, part of that would also be a database of genetic reference samples, which they would hope to get from all over the world. And she gave a kind of recent example of where such samples were used and how she sees this happening in the future.
Well, one specific one that just happened a while ago was the Pylos shipwreck. The shipwreck off the coast of Pylos, Greece. You'll recall about 5,000 migrants were on board a boat that was not seaworthy. I think the details are quite known, what happened. And the boat ended up capsizing off the coast of Pylos, Greece. We just by coincidentally, because we've been laying the groundwork for a future process in Syria, which now, can translate into work inside Syria, we happen to have genetic reference samples from Syrians. Some of those Syrians were on the boat, and we were able to help Greece make identifications. Okay? Now, that's just happenstance. We just happen to have this material. Imagine if, and this is what we're working towards, we create a situation where this standing capacity actually exists, and it has agreements, ICMP has agreements with multiple states to be on standby to help in these cases. That way the Greek authorities in Athens, they had the bodies of those that were dead in Athens and taking biological reference samples to try to identify them. We happened to have the reference samples. So we reached out to them. They didn't know we had these things. But this is a case that can be built upon because this is not going to stop. Today, Europe has the highest number of dead and missing migrants in the world. And this is a real human rights problem, which undermines our democracies because none of these cases are subjected to proper investigations. So having this capacity, again, allows countries in a pragmatic way, in a cost-effective way, to adhere to the rule of law and to secure the human rights of families of the missing, no matter where they are, no matter whether they're citizens or non-citizens.
Now, of course, you can't have a lab opening without actually talking to the scientists. So we also met with the head of the new DNA laboratory, Lucy Johnson, and asked her what her work actually entails. And here is going to be quite a bit of scientific detail for the real geeks among us.
So here at ICMP, we have 6 DNA laboratories at our headquarters facilities in The Hague, the Netherlands. And we receive in items from all around the world for DNA testing, and that includes two main types of testing. One is for DNA profiling and one is for DNA sequencing. But I don't want to bore your listeners too much with the technical details. I think it's useful to understand the types of items that we receive because we handle those very differently from a processing perspective. We receive in post-mortem remains, so unidentified bones and teeth that have been recovered in the field following mass casualties, incidents, be that conflicts such as war or natural disasters. And those bones are in a variety of conditions. They could be incredibly large portions of bone. They could be tiny fragments of bone. They could have been exposed to environmental conditions from something as simple as the weather or high humidity and heat. Or it could have been contaminants like oil or chemical weapons. Or the remains may have been burnt. And sadly, increasingly, especially with the submissions we are receiving from Ukraine at the moment, often the skeletal remains and teeth are heavily burnt. And that really does make our job a little bit more challenging. That said, that's what this laboratory specialises in. There's the profiling and sequencing of challenging unidentified human remains, so challenging samples.
Lucy explained that over the years, the ICMP's DNA laboratories have really specialized in and optimized the processes that can be applied to samples. And you can imagine they get cheek swabs and blood samples, but they also get other types of samples, like from bones.
The other type of item that we receive in are references. And so these are samples that are collected from family members of the missing. And they could be in the form of a small blood sample or a buccal sample. And that's the collection of some cells from the inside of your cheek. And we put that through a completely separate line that's separated by time and space. And that is to prevent any contamination between the post-mortem and reference workflows. And again, we have specialised techniques in being able to get DNA profiles from the reference samples. Both processes result in a DNA profile. The post-mortem items are obviously more challenging. Bone is a fantastic sample type for preserving DNA, but that actually makes our job easier because it's well preserved and protected within the mineral matrix of the bone. So we have to apply a lot of heat and chemicals to release the DNA and for us to be able to clean it up and detect it and visualise it. But over the years, we've refined the techniques, and the majority of the time, I'd say high 80 percentile, low 90s, depending on the context, we get a DNA profile that we're able to use. And that means that the resulting profile is loaded into our database here at ICMP and is continuously searched against the reference data set from the families of the missing. Sometimes there is a match, sometimes there isn't. Obviously, if there is a match, our expert scientists will analyse that, scrutinise it, quality assure it. And if it meets our statistical threshold for reporting, so following evaluation, we use a lot of statistics to evaluate the weight or the strength of the match. And if it is good enough, we will report that in the form of a report that will go to either a Missing Persons Institute or an organisation responsible for investigating missing persons in a particular jurisdiction or country.
And Lucy also mentioned some of the challenges there, as well as with the remains of people from Ukraine.
Yes, I asked her specifically about that, and she also explained about how each situation creates new obstacles to navigate.
So every context that we work in is always slightly different, and that could be the type of samples we're receiving, the conditions that they've come from. So a bone will degrade more quickly, usually, in very warm and moist conditions. So colleagues in the lab support a program in Vietnam identifying missing from the Vietnam War. These skeletal remains are now coming up to 70 years old in some areas, and they have been exposed to very humid climate for a long time, and so the level of degradation we see there is very different, We see a lot of microbial interference as well. So microbial interference also generates its own DNA. So it's a different type of cleaning. And the analysis we do with these samples is what we call sequencing or next generation sequencing. And we are actually currently optimizing a novel technique that will allow us to get sufficient information to allow us to compare resulting profiles to very distant family relatives. In that context, a lot of time has passed, so maybe 2 or 3 generations have since evolved since the conflict, and we need a testing technique that will allow us to compare DNA from family members that may be 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation. And by using this more detailed analysis, we can go down to the real building blocks of DNA and allow us to provide robust and reliable support for the identification process.
But what about other parts of the world where they've also faced long-term issues in terms of getting forensic investigations off the ground into mass atrocities?
I asked her specifically about that, and she went in a little more detail about that, and she also explained how each situation and each new country creates new obstacles for scientists to navigate.
The flip of that is, for example, in the South Americas, where sadly multiple regimes have led to many different groups going missing over many decades. And sadly, we see mass graves in a variety of different forms, often in mines or oil wells, where the land is incredibly rich in minerals or oily, and we see skeletal remains that have had oil penetrate them because they have been deposited in very oily conditions. And that causes us a different challenge. The oiliness of the bones, when we apply our processes to them, it competes with some of our chemicals. And we see it very clearly in the tubes. There is a distinct oily layer or separation in between the layers of chemicals that we don't usually see. So we have to do additional cleanups to try and remove that so that the chemicals don't impact negatively on the process. Again, every context is different. Even when we're talking about reference samples, although ICMP has fantastic collection campaigns out on the ground all around the world who are specialised in working with traumatised victims and to explain how DNA can be used in supporting the identification of missing people. We provide a lot of training also to these groups about the collection of samples to make sure that they're good quality reference samples. Sometimes we do see samples that are taken that are not the best quality, or it's really obvious the kits haven't been used correctly. And, for example, simple things like eating and drinking before donating a sample, especially a buccal sample, or smoking a cigarette. Simple things like that can really affect how difficult it is for us to get a DNA profile, even from a really good buccal sample.
Steph, I find it really interesting, but it's highly scientific, all of this stuff. And there you are, and you're describing these kind of pristine white labs and so on. But aren't we actually talking here about sort of very physical, sort of gooey remains, and isn't it all a bit icky?
Well, obviously not if you're in a lab, because it's nicely boxed up. But Lucy also explained on how she does her work in the field, and said that, some of these things, especially the smell, really stays with you.
It's important to note, although we are forensic scientists and we have a lot of responsibility to be independent, critical thinking and ensure that any work that is done here at ICMP is to the highest standard, we are also humans, and we are affected by the contexts that we work in, the stories and the information we collect from out in the field. They sit with you. And actually, I tend to find it's the pictures and the smells that sit with you most. You know, if you visit a mortuary or a mass grave, or you're processing remains, there are certain smells that come with that, and you can't unsmell them or unsee them. But I think that is incredibly important, that you remain a human, that you remember why we are doing this, and this is to allow people who have lost their loved ones to understand what has happened. So I think although it is sometimes difficult, it is our responsibility to go through that process and ensure that families can have that closure where possible.
Wow, I think that was a really interesting insight into this other world of which I always find really fascinating, how you do the forensics and how that whole world has changed and developed even in the kind of 20 or 30 years that you and I have been looking at all of this. So thank you, both you and Margarita, for taking us a bit behind the scenes there.
Yeah, to get a full picture, we really need a different kind of podcast, but it was really interesting to see some of those new investigations and techniques that they were using. And I thought it was particularly interesting to see how every conflict or every situation brings its own challenges. So I never really thought about that. With all the bombing, you would have more charred remains from Ukraine. And so there would be a different kind of challenge in identifying than you would have in the Bosnia conflict or in the conflict where there's not so much artillery fire in the kind of things that get covered by the ICC.
Yeah, it's all very real, very tactile. And as I made it clear, I find it quite icky, but also really fascinating to think about it. So again, let's see if we can get back into the ICMP and try and have another go and see exactly what they're up to.
Yeah, one of my most profound kind of outings is I actually visited the ICMP laboratory in Tuzla, where they have the Srebrenica remains. You would imagine that as kind of possibly icky, but it's very kind of businesslike. It's like an old converted office, and the remains are stored in cardboard bags, mostly not to affect them. And so there is a kind of pervasive smell of cardboard through that whole facility, which is really odd. So now every time I smell a cardboard box, I have to think of that ICMP laboratory. But it was really interesting to see how they kind of do that on the ground in Bosnia.
Thanks, Steph. Just to say, you can also support this podcast. Check out our supporters page, and there you'll find details of our Patreon and our newsletter.
Yeah, if you haven't had enough of us chatting about war crimes and making inappropriate jokes, then go over to Patreon, where you can get extra bonus content where Janet and I run our own War Criminals book club. We read books about war criminals. We don't commit our own.
And it's just the price of a cup of coffee. So see you there.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.